The lock on my grandmother's root cellar door was mounted backward. It bolted from the inside, and I was 46 years old before I understood why. And by the time I understood, 3 men with rifles they didn't know how to hold were walking up her gravel drive. And the thing that used to be our neighbor was standing in her cornfield, swaying, its head tipped at an angle no living neck can hold. I had driven up to bury her. That was the whole trip. A funeral in a town too small for a stoplight. A box of her things I didn't want to open. Instead, I found a list taped inside her flour tin, in her own hard handwriting, dated 11 days before she died. It wasn't a recipe. It was instructions, numbered. And the 7th line had my name on it. She had known. Before the news knew, before anyone I'd ever met knew what the word outbreak would come to mean, my grandmother had written down exactly what to do when the water stopped, when the power stopped, when the people you knew stopped being people. She wrote it while I was 300 miles away, screening her calls because I was busy. She thought the world was ending, and I told my wife she was losing her grip. She was right about all of it. And the safest place she built me turned out to be the one thing I couldn't bear to stay in. So let me take you back to where it started. The lock on the root cellar door was mounted backward. I noticed it the morning the Sirens started, and I've thought about it every day since. My grandmother had it installed to bolt from the inside, not to keep thieves out of the potatoes, to keep something out while people stayed sealed within. I was 46 years old before I understood that, and by the time I understood it, 3 men were already walking up her gravel drive with rifles they did not know how to hold. And the thing that used to be our neighbor was standing in her cornfield, swaying, its jaw working around a word it could no longer say. I had come to the farm to bury her. That was the whole trip. A drive up from the city, a funeral home in a town too small for a stoplight, a box of her things I did not want to open. Instead, I was standing in her kitchen holding a handwritten list she had left taped inside the flour tin. And the list was not a recipe. It was instructions, numbered, dated. The last entry was 6 days old. She had known, before the news knew, before the CDC knew, before the word outbreak meant anything to anyone I had ever met. My grandmother had written down what to do when the water stopped, when the power stopped, when the people you knew stopped being people. And she had done it while I was 300 miles away, screening her calls because I was busy. Let me start from the beginning. Her name was Odette Vachon, and she was 89 years old when she died in her own bed, which is more than most people managed that year. My name is Rennick. I was her only grandson, the son of a son who left the farm and never looked back. And I had inherited the same restless dislike of standing still. I designed heating and ventilation systems for commercial buildings. I understood airflow, pressure differentials, the way a sealed space breathes. It turned out to be the only useful thing I brought with me. The farm sat at the end of Coulter Road, 11 miles outside a town called Harlow in the northern part of the state, folded into low hills where the cell signal died, and the nearest hospital was 40 minutes on a good day. My grandmother had lived there alone since my grandfather passed. And alone before that, really, because he had been the kind of man who was present in body only. She kept chickens. She kept a garden the size of a suburban lot. She kept, I would learn, a great many things that made no sense until they were the only things that made sense. The call came on a Tuesday. A neighbor named Wendell Prue found her when she did not answer her door for the morning coffee they shared 3 days a week. Natural causes, the county coroner said, though he sounded distracted when he said it. And I remember thinking he sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with my grandmother. I drove up that Thursday. I did not know yet that Thursday was the last normal day I would ever have. The drive took 5 hours. The radio played the same national news over and over. A story about a cluster of illness in a meat processing region 2 states east. Something about respiratory symptoms and then neurological symptoms. And a spokesman using the word contained the way a man uses a word he does not believe. I turned it off somewhere around the 3rd repetition and drove the rest of the way in silence, watching the hills come up gold and empty, thinking about how I had not visited her in 2 years. I want to be honest about that. I had not visited in 2 years because the last time I came, she had sat me down at that same kitchen table and told me, calm as reciting the weather, that the world was going to fall apart in my lifetime, and I needed to learn how to live without it. I had smiled and nodded and driven home and told my wife my grandmother was losing her grip. My wife, Talia, had said maybe I should call more. I did not call more. That is the unfinished thing I carried up Coulter Road. And it is the thing that sat in my chest the whole time everything went wrong. The house was cold when I arrived. She kept it cold to save propane, always had. And the habit had outlived her by 3 days. I let myself in with the key she kept under a flower pot shaped like a hen. And I stood in the front room among her furniture and her smell. Cedar and wood smoke and the faint sourness of the goats she no longer kept. And I did not cry. I looked for the coffee instead. It is what she would have done. When you do not know what to feel, she used to say, do the next necessary thing. The next necessary thing was the flour tin. I wanted flour because I wanted to make the biscuits she made, some foolish, grieving impulse. And inside the tin under a folded cloth, I found the list. It was written on the back of a seed catalog envelope in her hard, slanting hand. At the top she had written a date from 11 days before she died. Below that, when the Prue boy comes back sick, do not open the door for him. Then numbered. 1. Fill everything that holds water. 2. The propane valve is the smaller wheel. Turn it clockwise to close. 3. The batteries are in the churn. 4. The cellar bolts from inside. The food is behind the false shelf. 5. Do not use the radio to talk, only to listen. 6. They cannot climb, but they do not stop. 7. Rennick will not believe any of this until he sees it, so let him see it once, then bring him down. I read my own name in my dead grandmother's handwriting, and the cold of the house went into me all the way to the bone. I did not understand it. I told myself it was the writing of a mind gone soft. The same fear she had tried to give me 2 years ago, the Prue boy. Wendell Prue had a grandson, a heavy, quiet kid named Merrick, who did odd jobs around the county. I had met him once. The idea that Merrick Prue would come back sick, that I should not open the door, that people could not climb but did not stop, was the raving of an old woman who had watched too much television alone in a cold house. That is what I told myself at 9 in the morning on Thursday. By 2 in the afternoon, the Sirens started in Harlow, 11 miles away, faint as a wasp behind glass. And they did not stop. I went out onto the porch. Sound travels strange in those hills, bounces off the ridge lines, so I could not tell what direction the sirens came from, only that there were more than one, and they were the long, rising, falling kind, civil defense, not police. I had not heard that sound outside of a movie in my entire life. Down the slope of her property, past the garden gone to seed and the dead tomato vines on their stakes. The corn stood in the far field, brown and unharvested, and something was moving in it. I thought it was a deer. Then it came to the edge where the corn met the mown grass, and it stood there, and it was a man. Or it had the shape of a man. He wore a canvas coat I half recognized, and his head hung at an angle a living neck does not hold for long, tipped hard to one side. And he did not wave, did not call out, did not do any of the things a person does when they see another person on a porch. He just faced me. Then he took a step, and his foot came down wrong, and he did not correct it, and he took another. I went back inside, and I locked the door. My hands did that before my mind decided anything. Then I stood with my back against the door, and I read the list again. And this time, I read it the way you read instructions, when the building is already on fire. The first thing I did was fill everything that holds water. It sounds like a small thing. It is not. My grandmother had a well with an electric pump, and I did not know how much power was left in the lines or how long it would stay. I filled the bathtub. I filled every pot, the canning kettle, 4 5-gallon buckets she kept clean in the pantry, the sink, 2 coolers. I worked fast and quiet, and while the water ran, I kept going to the front window. And the man in the canvas coat kept coming, slow, across the mown grass, falling and rising, falling and rising. And I understood after the third fall that he was not injured. He simply did not care what his body hit. He walked into the garden fence and pressed against it and kept walking, legs going nowhere. And the sound of his body against the wire was the worst sound I had heard in my life up to that point. It would not stay the worst for long. The power died at 4:11. I know the time because the microwave clock went dark. And I checked my phone, and my phone had no signal. 1 bar that flickered and vanished, a text to Talia that said, "Only stay home, don't drive spinning under a gray arrow that never turned green." The propane valve was the smaller wheel. I turned it clockwise to close it, the way she wrote, without fully knowing why, and only later did I understand. A house full of gas lines and no one to smell a leak is a house waiting to become a crater. She had thought of that. 89 years old, and she had thought of the thing a professional would think of. The batteries were in the churn, an old wooden butter churn in the mudroom, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 flashlights, a headlamp, and enough D-cells and AAs to run them for weeks. Beside them was a hand-crank radio, the kind that needs no power at all, and a spiral notebook, and a pencil sharpened with a knife. I want you to understand what that felt like. Every item on her list was where she said it would be. She had not been raving. She had been packing. For me. By full dark, there were 3 of them in the yard. The man in the canvas coat and 2 others who had come up from the road, and I recognized none of them clearly and did not want to. They did not group up. They did not seem to know about each other. Each one moved on its own broken track, drawn to the house, to the windows where my flashlight leaked around the edges of the curtains, and I killed the light and sat in the dark of my grandmother's front room listening to them walk into the walls. They could not climb. She had written it, and it was true. When one of them reached the porch steps, it did not step up. It walked into the riser again and again, the way the first one had walked into the fence, its body doing the same motion forever, because whatever ran, it had no way to solve a problem. But they did not stop. That was the horror of it, the specific new horror I learned that first night. A person gets tired, a person gives up, goes away, waits till morning. These did not. All night, into the walls, into the steps, into the door. A slow, arrhythmic knocking of bodies against wood that got into my skull and stayed there. I did not sleep. I sat with a kitchen knife I knew was useless, and I read the list a fourth time, a fifth, and I turned the crank radio just enough to listen the way she said, only to listen. And I found one station still broadcasting. It was an automated emergency message. A flat, synthetic voice, repeating shelter in place. Do not approach the infected. Do not attempt to render aid. The infection is transmitted through fluid contact, including bites and scratches. Then a pause. Then the same again. Under it, faint, a second voice bled through on an adjacent frequency, a live human voice. A man reading coordinates and a phrase over and over. And I could not make out the words the first night. I would spend a lot of the coming days trying to. I wrote in the notebook. Day 1, 3 in the yard. Power out 4:11. Water secured. Grandmother knew. I did not know why I wrote that last part. Maybe because writing it made it real. And I needed it to be real. Because the alternative was that I was alone in a cold house, imagining monsters. At dawn, I looked out, and there were 5. If a story about one man learning too late what his grandmother already knew is the kind of thing you'd want to see through to the end, stay with the channel. Now back to the farm. The morning of the second day, I made 2 decisions, and one of them nearly killed me. The first decision was to inventory everything, the way you would size a building before you design its systems. I went room to room with a notebook, and I counted. Food in the pantry, enough for a careful man to last 3, maybe 4 weeks. Water, secured. Roughly 120 gallons if the well pump stayed dead, and it looked like it would. Heat, none, with the propane closed. But there was a wood stove in the front room and a stacked cord under a tarp on the north side of the house. Outside, where 5 dead things now wandered. Light, covered. The crank radio, my only window on the world. The second decision was the false shelf. Her list said the food was behind the false shelf in the cellar, and I had not gone down yet because going down meant opening the cellar door. And the cellar door was the one she said bolted from the inside. And something in me did not want to be underground while those things walked the yard above. But I needed to see what she had left. So I lit the headlamp, and I went down the narrow stairs into the dark that smelled of earth and old apples. And I found the shelving unit against the far wall. Canning jars floor to ceiling, hundreds of them. Tomatoes and beans and peaches glowing amber in the beam. The right-hand section swung out when I pulled the bracket she had marked with a dab of red paint. Behind it was a space the size of a small closet, dug back into the hillside and shored with timber, and it was full. Not full of food, though there was food, full of the shape of a plan. Sealed buckets of rice and dry beans and oats, labeled and dated. A water filter, the good kind, ceramic, still in its box. Medical supplies in a fishing tackle case, sorted, with a laminated card listing what each thing was for. A shotgun and a box of shells, oiled, wrapped in a towel. And a stack of the same spiral notebooks she used, going back years, filled front to back with her small, hard writing. I sat down on an upturned bucket in the earth-smelling dark, and I read. The notebooks were a journal, but not a diary of feelings. They were a record, years of it. She had been watching, the way a farmer watches weather. Only what she watched was the country coming apart at the seams a thread at a time. Prices, shortages, the clinic in Harlow closing, the sheriff's department losing half its deputies to budget cuts, the way people got meaner in a dry year, and how the meanness spread faster than any sickness. She wrote about a disease first 3 years back. One line, a wire story she had heard on the radio about a pathogen jumping from livestock in a place I had never heard of, and how the story vanished from the news in a day and never came back. and how that was the thing that frightened her. Not the disease, but the silence around it. She had believed the silence. I had believed the news. One of us had prepared. The last full notebook was different. The last few months, her writing changed. She had started documenting the county itself. Trucks that stopped coming. A National Guard convoy on the interstate that a trucker friend told her about. And then, in the final entries, the Prue farm. Wendell Prue's grandson Merrick had gotten work at the meat plant 2 states east, the same region the news mentioned, and had come home in the fall, and had been sick, and had gotten better, and then had not been right. She wrote it plainly. Merrick Prue is not right. He stands in the Prue yard at night. Wendell says he doesn't sleep. I told Wendell to lock his doors. Wendell laughed at me. The man in the canvas coat. I had half recognized the coat because I had seen Merrick Prue in it. The one time I met him, hauling brush for my grandmother 2 summers back. The first of them in the corn was the boy she had tried to warn about. I understood then that her death and the outbreak were not 2 events. They were one. She had watched it start next door. She had written the list. And 3 days before, she could act on her own list. Before she could seal herself in the cellar she had spent years preparing. Her old heart had simply stopped. And she had died in her bed, while the things she predicted walked up the road toward her. I climbed out of the cellar, and I bolted the door behind me from the outside. Wrong, because I did not yet trust being sealed in. And that was the mistake. Here is what I did not understand yet about the bolt. My grandmother had it mounted to lock from within because the cellar was not a prison for the dead. It was a shelter for the living. A place you went and sealed yourself into and waited, with weeks of food and clean water and a filtered air path she had cut through the old root vent. The safest place on the property was down there behind that shelf. And I had just barred myself out of it and gone back upstairs into the house, with its many windows and its thin walls, because being underground scared me more than the things I could see. The things I could see got into the house that night. It happened because I got careless with light, and because I did not yet believe fully in my grandmother's rule about noise. I was working the crank radio in the front room, trying to pull the live voice out from under the automated message. And I had the headlamp on to write down what I heard. And I did not think about the north window with its curtain that did not fully close. A beam of my own light must have swept across it. I heard the change in the yard before I understood it. The walking bodies shifting from their aimless drift into a single direction, toward the north side, and then the sound of glass. They could not climb. But the north window was at grade, set low in the fieldstone foundation, a pantry window. And one of them walked into it, and its weight and the weight of the 2 behind it took the old glass out of the frame all at once. And then there was one of them in my grandmother's pantry with the water buckets, thrashing, knocking jars, its legs still going, walking itself deeper into the house. I did the arithmetic in about 1.5 seconds. I could not fight it, not with a kitchen knife, not against something that felt no pain, and would keep coming with a knife in it. The shotgun was in the cellar, behind the shelf, behind the door I had stupidly barred from the outside. What I had was airflow, and doors, and the layout of a house I had spent childhood summers inside of. I ran for the cellar door, and threw the outer bolt back and got it open, and got down 3 steps and pulled it shut over my head. And there was no way to lock it from where I stood, because it locked from the inside of the cellar. And I was on the stairs, and the door had a simple gravity latch that would not hold against a body. So I did the only thing left. I braced my back against the door, feet on the stairs, and I held it. It came. I felt it come through the wood, the arrhythmic shove of it. Not strong exactly, but tireless. And then a second one behind it. And the door bucked against my spine, and I set my heels into the stair tread, and I pushed back. And I stayed like that, in the dark, for what the notebook later told me was 6 hours, because I checked my watch when it started, and I checked it when it finally stopped mattering. They did not stop. She had written it. They do not stop. But bodies that no longer feel also no longer coordinate. And after a while, the pressure on the door became one weight, not two. And then it became a slack, leaning weight. One of them simply fallen against the door, with its legs still slowly working against the floor, going nowhere. And I was able to ease down onto the steps and get behind the false shelf and get the inner bolt at last and slide it home, sealing the cellar from within the way it was built to be sealed. And only then, with the shotgun in my hands and clean water at my feet and my grandmother's whole plan around me in the dark, did my body finally let go. And I shook so hard I could not have loaded the gun if I had needed to. I had needed to be shown once. She wrote that. Let him see it once, then bring him down. She had known me better dead than I had let her know me alive. I stayed in the cellar for 4 days. They were not empty days. My grandmother had built the space to be lived in, and living in it meant a rhythm. Water through the ceramic filter, jarred food eaten cold. The crank radio worked in short, careful bursts to save my arm and my nerves. The air path she had cut, a length of drain pipe running up through the root vent to a screened opening in the lee of the woodpile, meant I could breathe without opening anything. And I checked the screen with a headlamp and found she had even fitted it with a scrap of furnace filter. My trade, her forethought. And I laughed once in the dark, a bad cracked sound. Because of course she had. I learned to tell the dead apart by sound. Above me, the house had gone quiet after the two that broke in wore themselves against the cellar door, and eventually drifted off up the stairs, drawn by some other flicker of stimulus. And through the earth and the timber, I could hear the yard ones, their tuneless collisions with the walls. And I learned that they clustered when there was light or sound, and drifted apart when there was neither. Noise was not just risk. Noise was a beacon. She had written only to listen, never to talk on the radio. And now I understood the rule was not about the radio at all. It was about the whole way you had to live. You became a thing that received and never transmitted. You took in the world and gave it nothing to find you by. On the second cellar day, I finally pulled the live voice clear of the automated message. It came in best around dawn, the man reading his loop. And once I got the frequency steady, I could make out the words. He was reading coordinates, latitude and longitude. And then a phrase. The intake at the reservoir is holding. Come to the intake. The water is clean. And then a time. Broadcasting daily at first light and last light. And then he would read it all again. His voice was flat with exhaustion, but it was a real voice. A living man. Somewhere out there running a hand crank or a solar panel or a dying generator. Telling anyone who could hear that there was a place where the water was clean. I plotted the coordinates against my grandmother's laminated county map. The one she had left in the cellar with the rest. And the intake at the reservoir was 31 miles northwest, on the far side of Harlow, past the town, through it. And I sat looking at that distance, and I did my arithmetic again. 31 miles. No working vehicle that I knew of. My car was in the drive, keys in my pocket. But the drive was full of the dead, and I did not know if the roads were passable, or the car would even start after sitting. And a running engine was the loudest transmitter there is. On foot, 31 miles through country full of things that do not stop, was not a journey. It was a way to die tired. And I had, right where I sat, everything I needed to not go anywhere at all. Weeks of food, clean water, a sealed room. My grandmother's whole argument, made in cans and timber and forethought, was stay. So why did I write the coordinates in my notebook 3 times and circle them and keep the radio tuned to the living man? Because a sealed room with one man in it is not survival. It is a slower death with better scenery. My grandmother had built the cellar for herself. One old woman who needed only to outlast a bad season. She had not planned to be rescued because at 89, she was not the kind to be rescued. She was the kind to endure. I was 46. I had a wife 300 miles south in a city I could not reach and could not stop thinking about. A text that never sent. And I could not turn myself into a thing that only received. I needed to transmit. I needed to reach Talia or reach the man at the reservoir or reach anyone. And the cellar, for all its genius, could not do that. It could only keep me alive to want it. That is the trap my grandmother did not survive long enough to warn me about. The safest place is not always the place you can bear to stay. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments where you'd have gone, the cellar or the reservoir. Because I have gone back and forth on it every night since. Now, back to what happened. On the 4th day, the live voice changed. I had come to know his loop so well I could say it with him. And on the 4th morning, he did not read the loop. He read something new. And his flat voice had cracks in it. He said the intake is compromised. Do not come to the intake. And then a long silence, dead air. And I cranked the radio and pressed it to my ear thinking I had lost him. And then he came back and said if anyone is hearing this, who knows the North County, the old Vashon place on Coulter has a spring house. The water there runs clean off the ridge. I have it on a map from before. And then static took him, and he did not come back that morning or that evening or ever again on that frequency. I sat very still in the dark of my grandmother's cellar, and I understood 2 things at once. The first was that the man at the reservoir was dead or overrun, and that his last act had been to redirect whatever survivors could hear him toward clean water. And the clean water he named was here. My grandmother's spring house, the old Vashon place on Coulter. He had a map from before, and on that map, in a county with almost nothing on it, one property had a spring house fed off the ridge that would run clean no matter what happened to the reservoir or the well or the town. He did not know I was here. He did not know the place was surrounded by the dead. He only knew, from some old survey, that there was clean water at the end of Coulter Road. And with his last transmission, he had painted a target on my grandmother's farm and pointed every desperate living soul within radio range straight at me. The second thing I understood was worse, and it took me the rest of that day sitting with the notebooks to see it. And when I saw it, I had to set the headlamp down because my hands were not steady. My grandmother's spring house was real. She had written about it in the notebooks, a stone hut over the ridge spring, 40 yards up the slope behind the house, where she kept the water she drank because it never failed and never needed a pump. It was, in a sense, the whole reason the farm was survivable, the clean water that made everything else possible. And it was outside, 40 yards up an open slope from a house surrounded by the dead. My grandmother had planned to seal herself in the cellar with stored water, precisely because the spring house, her best water, was unreachable once the yard filled up. She had made peace with drinking from jars because getting to the spring meant crossing the open. But now, the living were coming for that spring. People who could hear a radio and read a map. and were desperate enough for clean water to walk into the North County. They would come up Coulter Road, and they would find a farm crawling with the dead. And they would find one man sealed in a cellar with a shotgun and weeks of food, and no way to help them, and no way to stop them from drawing every dead thing in the county down on all of us with the noise of their coming. The trap had a new shape now. It was not stay or go. It was, the place that keeps me alive is about to become a destination for the drowning. And there is nothing I can do to unring that bell. I made my decision that night, and I made it because of the unfinished thing. 2 years ago, my grandmother had sat me at her table and told me the world was going to fall apart. And I had smiled and nodded and left and told my wife the old woman was losing her grip. I had spent 2 years not calling. The last thing between us was my disbelief, my turning away from her. And she had answered my turning away not with anger, but with a cellar full of everything I would need, and a list with my name on it, and the words, "Let him see it once, then bring him down." She had loved me across my own contempt. She had prepared for the grandson who did not deserve it. I was not going to sit in her cellar and let people die on her doorstep for want of water she had spent her whole life keeping clean. Whatever else I was not going to become a thing that only received. But I could not simply open the door. I had watched 5 become 8 over the days I sat below. I could hear more of them in the yard, drawn by nothing I could name, and going out meant crossing open ground to a spring house 40 yards up a slope, and it meant doing it silently, because noise was a beacon. And it meant somehow making the spring reachable for people I had never met without turning the whole farm into a slaughter. So I planned it the way I would plan a building. I sat with the map and the notebooks, and I thought about airflow, about drawing things where you want them and away from where you don't, about pressure and release. And I built a plan out of the 2 things my grandmother had left me that I had not yet used: the woodpile and the noise. They clustered to sound. They drifted from silence. I had a house full of ways to make sound in one place, while I moved in silence in another. And I had my car in the drive, with a horn and a battery, and a set of keys in my pocket, a transmitter I had been too afraid to use. The plan was this. I would go out before first light, when they were most drifted apart, up through the north window they had already broken, quieter than the door. I would carry a length of my grandmother's clothesline and the tools from the cellar. I would reach the spring house, and I would do the one thing that made all of it worth the risk. I would run a line of hose she kept coiled in the spring house, down the slope, to the stone wall at the edge of the property by the road, so that anyone coming up Coulter for water could drink at the wall without ever crossing the killing ground of the yard. Clean water at the property line. A way to help the living without opening the house. My grandmother's water made reachable on my terms. And to cover the crossing, I would use the car. Not to drive, to lie. I would leave the driver's door open and rig the horn to sound once, long, from a distance, at the far south end of the drive, using the clothesline and a propped weight, timed to pull the cluster south while I worked north. One transmission. One lie told to the dead. Then silence again. And me back in the cellar before the sun cleared the ridge. I went out the north window in the blue dark, and the cold took my breath, and I did not make a sound. The yard at that hour was a field of slow shapes. I counted them as I moved, low, along the foundation. And there were 11, more than I had feared, spread across the mown grass and the dead garden in their aimless orbits. And I froze against the fieldstone every time one turned its ruined face my way and let it drift on. My grandmother's rule kept me alive minute by minute. Give them nothing to find you by. I breathed through my mouth, slow. I set each foot down, toe first, the way you walk a strange floor in the dark, so it will not creak. The car was where I left it. I opened the driver's door with both hands on it, easing the latch, and I rigged the horn line the way I'd practiced in my head. The clothes line running from the horn button back and down the drive to a fence post, and a propped stone on a stick that would fall and pull the line when I kicked the stick out on my way past. It was crude. It was the crudest thing I have ever built, and my whole life depended on it, firing once and only once at the right moment. I got to the base of the slope, and the spring house stood above me. A low stone hut with a wooden door, 40 yards of open grass between me and it, and no cover at all. 11 dead things behind me. First light maybe 20 minutes off. I could not cross that slope with them drifting loose behind me. The moment I broke into the open, any one of them that turned would key on the movement and come, and the others would follow the first, and I would be run down halfway up. So I kicked the stick. The stone fell. The clothes line pulled taut down the length of the drive. And at the south end of the property, 40 yards the other way, my car horn sounded. One long, flat blare into the dark, obscene and enormous in that silence. And every dead thing in the yard turned toward it as one and began to walk south. Into the sound, into the lie, walking themselves against the fence at the south end, where the horn died, and left them clustered and shoving at nothing. I ran up the slope. I did not look back. I hit the spring house door and got it open and got inside and put my back to the cold stone. And I could hear them down there, all of them, working against the south fence, drawn off. And the slope behind me was empty in the growing gray light. And it had worked. My grandmother's forethought and my one small lie had worked. Inside the spring house, the water ran clear and cold out of the ridge into a stone trough, exactly as she had written, endless, clean, indifferent to everything that had happened to the world. The coiled hose was there. My hands were steady now, work steady, the shaking saved for later, and I ran the hose out the low outlet at the base of the wall and down the slope, staying low, walking it down along the line of the old stone wall toward the road, 40 yards of it, 50, until the open end lay at the wall by the property line, where Coulter Road ran up to the farm. And I wedged it and weighted it, so the clean spring water ran out slow and steady onto the flat stone. And anyone coming up that road would find water without ever entering the yard. Then I turned to go back, and I saw them on the road. 3 people, living, coming up Coulter on foot in the first real light. A man and 2 others behind him, gaunt, gray-faced with exhaustion, carrying packs and a rifle held wrong. And I knew without being told that they had heard the Reservoir man's last broadcast, the old Vashon place on Coulter. The water runs clean, and they had walked through the night to reach it. And they had arrived at the exact moment my horn had pulled every dead thing in the yard to the south fence 40 yards from where they now stood. The man in front saw me. He raised the rifle, not to aim, just the reflex of a frightened person, and he opened his mouth to call out. And I understood in a flash of pure cold that if he shouted, if any of them made the sound a relieved and desperate human makes at the sight of another living face, the dead at the south fence would turn from my dead lie toward the living truth of 3 warm, loud bodies at the wall. And it would all come apart. The water, the plane, the fragile silence, all of it. I put my finger to my lips, hard, and I pointed, slow, down at the water running clean over the stone at their feet. And then I pointed south, toward the mass of the dead at the fence, and I shook my head once, and I watched the man understand. He was younger than his face, I saw now, and the two behind him were a woman and a boy of maybe 15, and the man looked at the water and looked at the dead and looked at me, and he lowered the rifle. He knelt at the wall, and he cupped the clean water in both hands, and he drank without a sound. And then he gave it to the boy, and then to the woman, and the three of them drank at my grandmother's water in total silence, while the things that would have killed them shoved uselessly at a fence 40 yards away. And I stood on the slope above them and did not make a sound either. The horn line was spent. I had one lie in me, and I had already told it. The dead at the south fence would not stay drawn forever. Already I could hear the cluster loosening, the tuneless collisions spreading back out as the memory of the sound faded from whatever passed for their minds. In minutes they would begin to drift again, and they would drift toward the nearest stimulus. And the nearest stimulus was now 4 living people on an open slope. I had a choice, and I had about 90 seconds to make it. And it was the choice my grandmother's whole life had been building toward, without either of us knowing. I could go back to the cellar. The north window was clear. I could be behind the false shelf with the bolt thrown before the dead worked their way back north. And I would have clean water at the property line for whoever came, and food for weeks, and a sealed room. And I would survive. Alone. The way she had planned to. The way she had made peace with. I could receive and never transmit and outlast the bad season and be a living man in a dead county. Or I could bring them down. Let him see it once, then bring him down. Her words had been about me, but I understood now they were a principle, not an instruction. The cellar was built for more than one. There was food for weeks that stretched thinner across 4, but stretched. Water without limit off the ridge. And a boy of 15 drinking from a wall with his whole life still theoretically ahead of him. I could open the thing my grandmother had built to keep the world out, and let the world in. And in doing so, I would be spending the safety she had died before she could use on strangers. And I would be transmitting, loud, making the farm a place where the living gathered. Which is to say, a place the dead would eventually find. I went down the slope. I did it without a word, because words were sound, and sound was death. And I took the man by the sleeve, and I put my mouth to his ear, and I said, so low it was barely breath, "There is a cellar, food and water, but you come silent or you don't come." And I watched him weigh a stranger's whisper against the open road behind him, and the dead beginning to loosen at the fence. And he nodded. We went up the north window one at a time. The boy first, because he was smallest and quietest. Then the woman, then the man, then me. And I got the window covered, and I got them down the cellar stairs in the dark with a hand on each shoulder, and I threw the inner bolt home behind us just as, above, I heard the yard change, the collisions swinging back north, the dead returning to a house that now held 4 living hearts instead of 1, drawn by nothing they could name and everything I had just done. The 4 of us sat in the dark of my grandmother's cellar and breathed. And the shaking came for me at last. And I let it. Their names were Corwin, who had carried the rifle, and Sabine, and the boy was Theo, and they were not related except by the road. Corwin had been a lineman for the county power company, which is why he understood, once I explained it in whispers, everything I told him about noise and light and airflow, and why he was worth more to our survival than any 3 armed men would have been. Sabine had been a nurse at the Harlow Clinic before it closed, and when I showed her my grandmother's tackle case of medical supplies with a laminated card, she wept without sound, one hand pressed over her own mouth. because she had walked 30 miles imagining a world with no medicine left in it. Theo did not say what he had been. Theo was 15 and had watched things a 15-year-old should not watch. And he did not talk much. And he took to my grandmother's notebooks the way I had, reading them by headlamp in the corner. And I let him, because a person needs somewhere to put their mind. We survived, and I will not pretend surviving was clean. The dead never left. That was the cost I had chosen, and I paid it every day. 4 living people in a sealed cellar under a house is 4 transmitters no wall fully contains. And the yard above us grew from 11 to a number I stopped counting. Drawn from all over the North County by some accumulation of scent and sound and warmth we could not fully mask. Until the farm was ringed by them, and going out for anything became a thing we planned for days and executed like surgery. The clean water at the wall drew the living too, more of them over the weeks. And we could not take them all. And I had to stand on the slope more than once, and point at the water and point at the dead. And shake my head, and watch people I could not save drink and move on. And some of them did not move on in time, and I had to hear it. That was the truth the reservoir man's kindness and mine had built. Clean water in a dead land is a mercy and a lure, and there is no way to make it only the first. Corwin and I ran the hose deeper into the season, kept it flowing, kept the wall a place where a silent stranger could drink. And we buried what we had to bury when the drinking went wrong. At night, quiet, because even the burying had to be silent. Sabine kept Theo alive through a fever in the 8th week that would have killed him without the supplies my grandmother had sorted and labeled and left. And I sat with the boy through the worst of it and told him about the old woman who had done the sorting, the one who saw it coming when no one believed her. And I think it helped him to know that somewhere in the past, someone had cared enough about a future she would not see to leave medicine for a boy she would never meet. I never reached Talia. I want to be honest about that, because a story that ties off clean is a lie, and my grandmother did not raise me on lies, even though I did not learn that until she was gone. The text never sent. The 1 bar never came back. Somewhere 300 miles south is a city I cannot reach, and a wife I do not know the fate of. And I keep the crank radio, and I listen at first light and last light the way another man once did. And I do not talk, only listen. And I have not heard her voice, and I have not stopped listening. That is the thread that stays open. That is the one I carry now, the way I once carried my 2 years of not calling. We are still here. It is the spring after the fall, it all came apart. And the ridge water still runs clean and indifferent out of the stone. And the garden my grandmother kept is coming back where we cleared the dead from it. And Theo is taller and talks more. And Corwin taught him to work a line. And Sabine has started a new notebook in my grandmother's hand-me-down style, recording what we learn, so that if it ever comes apart again, someone will have written it down for whoever comes next. That was her real inheritance. Not the cellar, not the water, not the food. The habit of leaving instructions for the people who won't believe you until it's too late. I think about the lock on the root cellar door, mounted backward, the thing I noticed the morning the Sirens started and did not understand. It bolts from the inside. She built it to seal the living in, not to keep the dead out. Because she understood the thing, it took me a season of the dead and the drowning to learn. The danger was never only what walked the yard. The danger was becoming a man who would seal himself away from the world and call it safety, who would only receive and never transmit, who would let the water run clean and unshared and outlast everyone and be alone at the end of it. She left the bolt on the inside so that whoever went down there would have to choose, every time, whether to open it again. I choose to open it. I've opened it for strangers at the wall, and I will open it again. And each time I do it, costs us a little more safety and buys someone else a little more life. And that arithmetic never balances, and I do it anyway. Because my grandmother spent her whole life keeping the water clean for a world she was not sure deserved it. And the least I can do is let people drink. She knew how to survive long before the outbreak came. What she was really trying to teach me, in the cellar and the list and the backward lock, was that surviving is the easy part. It is the staying human while you do it that costs everything. I did not learn it in time to tell her I understood. I'm telling you instead. And down in the dark, behind the false shelf, in her hard slanting hand, the last notebook is full now, and there is a new one started, and it is mine, and the first line I wrote in it was her name.